Getting out of the military can leave somebody carrying pressure in places that no one else can see. Your job might be steady, your family might be counting on you, and life might be looking just fine from the outside. But inside, there can still be a fight to find purpose, stay calm, communicate well, and stop feeling like the best version of yourself got left behind with your uniform. Our guest today, Dave Berke, knows that world from more than one angle. He spent 23 years in the Marine Corps, flew fighters, taught at Top Gun, and now teaches leadership with Echelon Front. This conversation pulls leadership out of the boardroom and puts it where it matters every day, in your home, your work, your transition out of the military, your failures, and even the moments when pressure starts to take over. From this episode, you'll walk away with a clear way to slow down, take ownership without crushing yourself, build stronger relationships, and start moving toward a life after service that still feels meaningful. And before we get into this conversation, make sure you're connected with Drive On beyond the podcast. Go to driveonpodcast.com/subscribe and join our email list. It's the best way to stay connected, get updates from the show, and hear about resources, stories, and conversations built for veterans and their families. Before we begin, though, I do want to take a moment to raise awareness for something that's important to our community, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation. This organization is working to build a permanent national memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor the service members, families, and civilians who are impacted by the global war on terrorism. This memorial will be both a tribute to those who served and a way to ensure that their sacrifices are recognized and remembered for generations to come. If you'd like to learn more or find out how you can support their mission, visit gwatmemorialfoundation.org. Now let's get into today's episode. Hey, Dave, welcome to the show. I'm really glad to have you here.
Yeah, good to be here, man. Appreciate your patience. Glad to finally get connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like we've been saying a little bit before we started recording here, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time, and you know we've kind of gone back and forth, and here we are. So I'm glad to kind of jump into it. But
Yeah.
before we kind of dive into the conversation, I'm sure some of my listeners are already familiar with you, but for some of them who maybe aren't, could you maybe introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, for sure, man. I'm Dave Berke. I'm a leadership instructor at Echelon Front, which is leadership consultancy. My background is I did 23 years in the Marine Corps, mostly flying airplanes, flew a couple different fighters, spent a little time on the ground. And then after I left the Marine Corps, joined Echelon Front, and I teach leadership with two Navy SEALs that started a company that has grown into a big leadership consulting company, and I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And you know that's where I first heard your name kind of thrown around. Probably listening
Yeah,
to one of the episodes on Jocko's podcast. That's probably where I first heard your name. And
yeah.
you know then your name gets kind of tossed around. I'm sure that's where a lot of people have kind of heard you as well. So like I said, really glad to have you here, and been looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome.
Now, so you talked about flying the planes and things like that in the Marine Corps, and you know I know a lot of folks probably know Top Gun from the movies and
Yeah.
things like that, and so I'm sure there's some major differences between the movies and and real life. But what would you say about that environment that you went through, kind of in that arena, that teaches you about preparation and performance and all the
Yeah.
things that come into it that maybe you've taken forward to your career now?
Yeah, well, the question was great because yeah, there's certainly some differences in the movies from the real Top Gun. Movies are
Sure.
awesome, love them. I thought they were both fantastic. I don't have anything critical to say about them, but yeah, they're movies. They're certainly not there to capture exactly what real life is like for a Top Gun instructor or a Top Gun student. And I think what you asked is true. Is one of the differentiators there is, that's a school. It's a super demanding, very demanding environment. They expect a lot of preparation and the preparedness that goes along with that. You learn a lot of good lessons at Top Gun, both again as a student, as an instructor, that apply to every aspect of life.
Mhm.
Hard work, preparation, take advantage of good luck and timing, good opportunities, make the most out of those, put yourself in a position to be successful. But ultimately, the effort that you put into things leading to hopefully being very humble, being very open minded, being very willing to learn. Those are all attributes that make you successful at Top Gun. And clearly, just by hearing me say that, those are the same things. Those are universal. Those things apply everywhere. So Top Gun's a great place, like kind of a microcosm for life. And what you learn there really has served me well in every aspect of my life.
Right. And when you're talking about Top Gun, you're talking about you, you know flying these millions of dollars worth of plane and equipment, and you're talking about real life and death decisions. But when you take that kind of mindset away from that school and apply it to your daily life, I mean, you're why shouldn't you treat daily life like a life and death decision? Yeah, and not,
Yeah.
not to say that everything has to be so intense at that level, but you know, it real life deserves everyday life deserves that level of kind of care and consideration as well, where you're not just floating through life and just not making good decisions because who cares. It's I'm not dealing with a multi-million-dollar plane. I'm dealing with my commute to work or whatever. But you're
Yeah.
dealing with other things in life that could be, that you could take some of that stuff and apply it to, and why not make it better, right?
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said. And yeah, certainly, I mean, flying airplanes, combat in the military, there's some uniqueness to that, and I wouldn't deny that. But
Sure.
ultimately, life is life. And the way you approach those things, I think that attitude and mentality you just alluded to is a good one to have in all aspects of life. And by the way, everything that everybody does, I'm glad that not everything is life and death, but in all work that's being done, there's livelihoods at stake, and companies, and organizational success, and you're trying to raise kids and families, and there's a lot at stake in really all the things that we do. And I think, to your point, take full advantage of that, and try to get the most out of every single day. And it being life or death should not be the forcing function to have that type of mentality. So I totally agree with you, man.
Right.
And I think, you don't want to take things too seriously ultimately, but you got one shot at this. Take full advantage of that and understand, like I said before, the lessons and the things I learned there, they apply everywhere. And the life or death component of it should not be the differentiator. It's just opportunities in life. Take advantage of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you alluded to in the beginning there when you introduced yourself that you operate in kind of different environments throughout your military career, between aviation, and you spent some time on the ground, you said, and now to what you're doing now is in leadership training. How did your understanding of leadership change or evolve as these various missions changed for you? Like how did
Yeah.
or did it evolve? Maybe it kind of remained the same.
No, it definitely did. And, that was probably one of the biggest leadership lessons that I came to grips with in my professional career. And I wrote about it when I was capturing things that I'd learned in my life. When I joined the Marine Corps, when I was a kid watching Top Gun in the movie theater, fantasizing about flying airplanes off carriers and wanting to be a fighter pilot and wanting to be in the military, I'd say most of that was driven by my individual goals, my individual pursuit, and what I wanted to do. And you don't have to be in the military to know this, but ultimately, what I came to discover is being in the military, like that is the ultimate team sport. And the work that I did, the goals that I was setting for myself, when I finally got into the Marine Corps and I started learning how the Marine Corps views leadership and views being an officer in the Marine Corps, it's all about other people. It's all about the team. So there was a lot of humility I had to learn and recognize that these things that I was pursuing, which kind of seemed to be about me, weren't about me at all. And, young, immature, arrogant Dave Burke learned a lot of lessons in the military and totally changed my leadership mindset, is that the things that I'm doing shouldn't be for myself. They should be for the people around me. And,
Sure.
that was an important lesson learned that, of course, applies to everything. Like we said this before already, every topic we've touched on so far is lessons that apply everywhere. Leadership is leadership is leadership. Those lessons apply everywhere. I absolutely evolved in my time to get out of my singular focus about myself and focus on the team and the people you're there to support.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting when you mentioned that there, I started thinking about folks who are getting out of the military or have been out of the military. They're veterans. They're moving on with their life and they're re-entering into the civilian world, if you will. And that teamwork in mindset that you were talking about, where you're working to kind of support the team. It's that ultimate team sport, if you will.
Yeah.
And a lot of times veterans will just kind of try to go it alone, and they're not relying on a team or any group of people. They're just, what, I'll be stubborn and figure it out. I know I was guilty of that when I first got out of the military, and I got out and I struggled with all sorts of things, and in my head, it was like, well, that's on me. I need to figure it out. And
Yeah.
sure, that to some extent that's true, but there's so many resources and people out there who you can lean on to help you out. No one's an expert on everything, and so you can kind of reach out to those folks to help you out and get you back on the right path, and hopefully shorten the amount of time that you're on that path and get you back on the right path. So
Yeah.
I know a lot of times veterans, they leave, they miss having that, whether it's a clear mission, that teamwork that we talked about, or even that shared sense of purpose amongst other folks. What have you learned about building a team, building that type of stuff up again after getting out of the military?
Yeah, I think I had a very similar experience there. And listen, to your point, I love that, that entrepreneurial spirit. I love that
Sure.
attitude of like, hey, this is on me. I got to take responsibility. I think there's some real powerful elements to that. But just like you said, and we know this in the military, and it's really true everywhere, is first of all, you're going to accomplish way, way more with a team than you are by yourself. And ultimately, I think one of the things that's really necessary, even if you're in some sort of role or job or maybe it's just you, a business that you're starting on your own or a pursuit that you have, if you think of it outside just yourself, whatever it is that you're doing, very likely is going to affect other people, family members, friends, community. Maybe you're building something or designing something or creating something to get out into the world. It's not hard to recognize it over time, like, hey, this is going to be more than just yourself. And
Mhm.
I think that should be embraced. I think one of the hardest things about the transition is those of us when we're in uniform, we kind of take for granted that what we're doing matters, and we kind of take for granted that we have this clearly defined, understood mission that we believe in. And you really have to find that outside of uniform too. When you transition, like I got no judgment. You could go do any job that you want, literally anything, but you have to have belief in what you're doing. And it
Mhm.
really doesn't matter as long as you have belief in what you're doing. And I think finding a career, finding a second path, finding a second place to go after the military, it can get a little cloudy, when you're living on that government paycheck and you think, hey, it's the private sector. I want to go make some money. You might be looking at how much money you're going to make or your salary or other things. You could have a really high paying job, but if you don't believe in what you're doing, you are gonna struggle. So I think embedded in that, hey, you can certainly go it alone for certain things. I love that. Again, that mentality, that mindset in certain areas. But
Mhm.
eventually, you're going to have to recognize it has to be about more than just yourself, and you have to believe in what you're doing. And I think a team is something that really helps with that. People you care about, people you're embedded with, people you're working alongside, or maybe people you're serving, whatever it might be. Got to think larger than that. It is certainly not about the money when you transition. It's got to be about something that fills that same void. Again, doesn't matter what the career is, you got to believe in it and you got to pursue it in a way that fulfills those same needs that we all have, that it can't just be us.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's very similar to something I had a conversation recently with my kids. They're teenagers, and they're talking about, like, things that they're interested in. What's that
Yeah.
career going to look like for them, and obviously, they don't have to have it all figured out right now and know exactly what they're going to do at this point. But
Yeah.
as they're starting to think to the future and what might be that next step for them, they were looking at careers that, what's that salary for this career? What's that type of thing. I said, like, yeah, sure, the salary is important. Obviously want to be able to afford the lifestyle that you want to have and all that kind of stuff, but uh, you want to make sure that the job is fulfilling too. It's something that
Yeah.
you, like you said, it's something that you believe in. It's something that is rewarding. It's something that, ideally you will enjoy getting up and going to work every day. It's not one of those things
Yeah.
where it's a drag to get yourself out of bed and, get to work every day and all that kind of stuff. So, find something that you really turns you on, and then figure out the money piece. And
Yeah.
then, once when you do that, I think all those pieces can come together. It's not like, mutually exclusive, where you're going to have, a job that you really love, but you can't make any money at. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you can find that in a lot of areas. Now, maybe not everything. If what you're really passionate in is no one's paying for it, well, obviously you're going to have to find something else. But if you can find a way to make money at that thing that you really enjoy, I think that's one of those things where people say, you'll never have to work a day in your life if you can find something that you truly are passionate about about and actually enjoy. So I love that advice that you just gave there, as far as finding that passion or that purpose in the thing that you wind up doing after the military. So
Yeah,
um,
I think it has to be central to any decision. And yeah, kids, they don't always see the whole picture at that age, but I think it's
yeah,
very good advice.
yeah, absolutely. And of course, advice coming from dad is, taken with a grain of salt with with kids, but
Yeah, of course.
it is what it is. I try to do my best with that. So, hopefully I say it enough and something latches on. But anyways, going back to your military career, can you maybe think of a time when maybe a setback or a failure taught you something that was more impactful than something that was successful? Something
Yeah.
where you might have failed or a team might have failed, and that just gave you a super profound lesson or something like that.
I mean, anything I ever learned in life that was really meaningful came from a failure. Like, there's no
Mm,
question about that. And at the end of my career, certainly now reflecting back on it, things that I've written about, things that I share stories about, things that I reflect on, all of the main key drivers of what I learned about what good leadership is, the things you do and the things you think about, how you act and how you think, all came from a recognition about me either doing something wrong, a mistake that I made, a path that I was on that was the wrong path. So, I know it's a cliche, but failure is obviously the best teacher,
mhm,
and that is true for me. And honestly, if you can identify like any leadership attribute, any leadership trait, any leadership mindset that I have learned to be true, I have discovered that through the process of, shooting myself in the foot, making a mistake, doing something wrong, learning a hard lesson, seeing my ego get out of control. And so everything that I look back on that I recognize now is a model of good behavior was learned from mistakes. Now, that said, I mean, there's a lot of folks out there that have done a really good job capturing these lessons, and I wish I was more open-minded early on to learning through other people's mistakes. You're not required to make the same mistakes that I and maybe
right,
you had made as well.
sure.
You're gonna make. I mean, listen, there's no avoiding it. But boy, it would be certainly nice to capture something or latch onto something or embrace something based on someone else's experience that can help guide you down the right path. And I think there's some strength in that. But ultimately in life, there's no denying in my life, and it's probably true for most people, is that the things that really sunk in that made the biggest impact typically came from some sort of failure.
Yeah, and I bring that up because a lot of times folks who are struggling with some sort of failure, whether it's a failed, they got fired from a job, or a marriage, or any, it doesn't matter what the failure is really.
Yeah,
They're beating themselves up over it because they're just they're not sure, like, okay, what went wrong. Obviously you want to figure that piece out so you don't go do it again, but sometimes they don't take those lessons away and they kind of internalize it and let it define them, that okay,
yeah,
now I've screwed up this, I've screwed up that, I've screwed up this other thing. Now that's just who I am. I'm a screw up, and I'm that type of
yeah,
person. But that's not true if you can take some lessons away from that, and instead of letting it define you and just being, well, that's just who I am. Well, no, you're someone who made a mistake, and lots of people make mistakes, or lots of people try things and fail at it, and I think that's, like you said, probably everybody has done something like that, and that's fine. Like, you're kind of supposed to make those mistakes. That's how you learn. I mean,
yeah,
think back to when you were a kid and you fell off your bike as you're learning how to ride a bike. Like, well, that
yeah,
hurt. Well, don't do that again. So figure out how to do that a little bit better, and and then figure it out and move on, and you get better and better and better at lots of things, and eventually you're not making those types of mistakes anymore. And I think that's the lesson that you need to take away, is like, what can I do to improve whatever this situation is, so I don't have to experience that again, right?
yeah. Listen, I mean, I think that's great advice. If you are listening to this or watching this and you are, you know, cloaked in mistakes and failure and doing things wrong, you're in good company. I mean, that is just the human experience. And
Yeah,
so, listen, and you know, you talked about, maybe you got fired or maybe you got divorced. Not everybody's gone through that. Not everybody can experience that. But the idea that somehow like A, failure is what defines you, and B, failure is something you're supposed to try to avoid. I mean, it's just simply not how life in the world works. And I think the beautiful thing about the concept of ownership, that Jocko and Leif wrote about in their book Extreme Ownership, they really defined how are you going to respond to these things. And the only real failure with failure is failing to respond correctly, to do what you said, which is learn the lessons, make the changes, apply something different, get better at doing things. Failure is a teacher, and the only thing that keeps it from working is the responsibility that comes along with that. And so
Yeah.
it should spend hopefully less time wrestling with the reality of that you're going to make mistakes and fail. You are, we are, I do, I continue to this day. All of us do that. But there's so much great benefit from embracing that if you're objective enough to say, hey, this was about me. This is something I did. Here's what I learned. Here's how I can get better. Then all of a sudden, those failures, even sometimes your biggest failures, can serve as your biggest lessons and make the biggest positive impact in your life. So, like I
Yeah.
said, you're making mistakes. Welcome to the club. You're in good company.
Welcome to the club. Exactly. And I think you mentioned some of the stuff that Jocko had written about, and one of his sayings that he uses rather frequently is just it's just a one word saying. It's just good.
Good.
And like good, yeah, you made that mistake. And I use that sometimes with my kids. And again, this isn't like a parenting podcast, but it's more for geared towards veterans. But it's the same idea,
Yeah,
in really any situation. But good. What you might have messed up on that thing. What did you learn from it?
that's
You
right.
can take that lesson away from it at least, and that's I think a good way to look at it. And I think part of the reason why people don't necessarily take away those lessons is, especially in like a high pressure situation, people get overwhelmed really
Yeah,
really quickly. I think in some situations, and especially as a fighter pilot, I'm sure there's things that were very high pressure in your career. There are things that probably got overwhelming really quickly, and you don't really have time to get overwhelmed and worry about those types of things. You kind of have to probably slow things down a little bit and think clearly to help you make better decisions. What were some ways that you found that you were able to kind of slow things down and be able to make better decisions without getting overwhelmed and really panicking and that type of thing?
yeah. I think you described it well. I mean, it's certainly true inside the cockpit of an airplane. It's true in all aspects of life. You feel the frustration, the anxiety, you feel the emotions start to rise, and if you react or act on those emotions, you're going to just probably make things worse.
Yeah.
And that's a good leadership lesson. It's a leadership lesson from the cockpit, but it's an and relevant to all aspects of life is when you start to get a sense of those things starting to creep in, those emotions, those anxieties, those frustrations, and things start to escalate, you really have to understand the path that you're going down is probably going to be destructive and counterproductive. And one of the things we teach at Echelon Front is this concept, we call it detachment, which is essentially you got to take a step away from those emotions. You got to relax. You got to take a deep breath. You got to, just like you said, slow things down a little bit. That can be a little easy to say, harder to do. But one of the things that I think all people have the ability to do if they're open minded and humble and are self aware, which easier said than done, but if you can kind of check your ego, you can be honest with yourself of what it's like when you start to feel those heightened emotions, when you're getting those anxieties and those frustrations. We know there's a feeling, there's a sensation to that. And, as we get older, we become more and more equipped to be able to respond. Kids can't do that. Kids
Mm.
throw temper tantrums. They lose their mind. They completely lose it. And we see that as parents. And one of the things we're always trying to do is help them maintain a little bit of control. And one of the best ways to do that is to know our own red flags, our own little indicators. What does Dave Burke do when he gets frustrated? In the cockpit, I would, squeeze the control stick, or maybe my shoulders would tense up and I'd get kind of sore, fatigued, or I'd clench my teeth and go, oh, hey, that's a sign of something. And if I can recognize that early, I can intervene and do exactly what you said, which is, hey, take a deep breath, relax, slow things down a little bit, and I can set myself back up on a better path. It's when those emotions kind of get out of control, it's really hard to recover. And
Mhm.
once you kind of lose control of that, it's hard to bring, if I go to you and you're completely losing your mind, I go, hey, just calm down. That's not very helpful. It actually might
Right.
might make things worse.
Sure.
But if at a little bit of escalation, we see in each other, we're starting to get a little frustrated and we can intervene then, as adults, as leaders, as people who are learning about themselves, if you can be humble enough to recognize what that's like for you, you can do a much better job intervening and preventing it from happening, which is really the goal. And I think, that's a little maturity, it's a little humility, it's open mindedness, it's self awareness, but ultimately it's good leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I remember years ago, I was learning to scuba dive. And one of the things that the instructor told us is just don't panic when
Stay
you're under.
calm.
And I know easier said than done sometimes when, your mask falls off or,
Yeah,
you can't find your air or anything like that. So easier said than done. But then again, a few years later, something happened where my mask got knocked off and I'm sitting there underwater and I'm having this problem and I'm thinking to myself, okay, don't panic. Like because it's not going to help me. I'm,
good.
however 60 feet underwater and that's not going to help me by panicking. And, now I just need to figure out, okay, what do I need to do to solve this problem? I need to calm down. I obviously I can't breathe because I didn't have my regulator in my mouth. So, I'm kind of screwed as far as that goes. So I need to calm down and I need to figure out, okay, first things first, what do I need to do? And then do those things to solve the problem and just work through it. And then once when you do, then you can kind of get that sigh of relief and be like, okay, good. I didn't panic. I didn't lose control of the situation. It was scary maybe at that time, but at the same time, once when you think through what needs to be done, you kind of just in my mind anyways, what happened with me, I distract myself with this checklist of things I need to do, I need to be able to breathe, I need to be able to see, I need to get all this stuff back in order. And if I just start panicking, I'm not going to be able to do any of that stuff. And so, I just kind of worked through that checklist until I got through it, and then everything was back to normal. And I was good to go. But it's again just not panicking and working through the problem and figuring it out. So, like I said, easier said than done sometimes, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
You have to work through these problems and not lose your cool while you're doing that too. And I know just switching gears a bit, I know we talked a little bit about parenting, just a couple anecdotal comments here, but I know a lot of the listeners are they're either leading at work while also trying to be present at home as husbands or fathers or friends or whatever the case may be. How do the leadership principles that you teach apply inside the family, not just at work, but like inside family situations?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And what I've come to discover, when I started teaching leadership at Echelon Front, it was very business focused. It was about the companies that were hiring us and we were working
Hmm.
with. And over time, the more we did it, the more questions we get asked, the more we understood how relevant it was to our family lives, our personal lives, in our neighborhoods, our
Yeah,
communities, our homes, our spouses, our kids. I mean, leadership is leadership, and good leadership applies everywhere. And by the way, so does bad leadership. If you have leadership and attributes in the military that lead you to failing with your team, your platoon, or your squadron, you're going to fail at home too. So, leadership applies in every capacity of life, every aspect, at home, at work, in your
mhm,
community, and within yourself as an individual. We talked about that earlier. And so there's an undeniable link there. And I think something that I've really come to embrace and truly believe is that at home, I think, is where it matters the most. If you can apply these things, listen, we go to businesses, we work at companies, we help them diagnose their problems, we give them some tools, help them solve their problems. It's great. It gets them back on track, gets them back on schedule, gets them back on budget. Those are all great things. And that's important. But if you were to ask someone to say like, hey, I'm really struggling with my team that's underperforming a little bit, we're a little bit behind schedule, a little bit over budget on delivering this product, and hey, my kids are not thriving, they're struggling at home, they're not doing well at school, they're on the wrong path, which of those two things matters more to me? I mean, it's a simple answer.
sure,
And it turns out that the
absolutely.
solution, yeah, the solution is the same. And so when we recognized that the principles apply at home and started to tailoring some of the communication, some of the message, and some of the examples to apply it in people's personal lives, that's when we saw the most important feedback. People come to us and say, hey, this has impacted my marriage. It's impacted the relationship with my kids. It made my home better. It made me a better husband, made me a better wife, maybe a better spouse, whatever. There's so much power in that. And I have come to understand that leadership is exactly the same. Now, it is hard at home because your emotions are so closely connected to these people. These are your kids, these are your spouses, these are the people you care about the most. So that idea of detaching from emotion, easier said than done, but
Mhm.
ultimately when you can apply the things that we teach to your personal life, that is where the strongest and most powerful and important impact is. It's undeniable. Absolutely how you described it.
Yeah, absolutely. And when things are not going well at home, like you mentioned, your kids maybe are having trouble with whether in school or they're just not thriving in one way or another, you're going to probably take that to work with you too. That's going to be in the back of
100%.
your mind. It's going to affect your performance at work too. So, it has that impact across your whole life. You can't just turn it off as soon as you walk through the door at work and
Yeah.
say, you know what, family doesn't matter anymore because I'm at work. And, you know, you really have to be able to kind of balance those things. I know, people talk about work life balance and all that kind of stuff, but you want to be able to make sure that home is good to go when you walk into that door so that you can focus on work and get the
Yeah.
job done. And if you can't, if there's so much going on at home, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to turn that focus for home, turn that off while you're walking through the door at work. And so, absolutely right with what you're saying there. I totally
Yeah.
agree. And going back to the veteran aspect, I think sometimes a lot of us get the the transition wrong when we're trying to apply like military leadership lessons to the civilian workplace. The way you talk to somebody in the military might not be the best way to talk to folks in a civilian workplace. And we try to take that all those skills and stuff, especially people who, they graduate high school that, 18 years old or so, and they join the military, spend 20 plus years in the military, and then they jump into the civilian workplace. All they ever knew was a military environment as far as their
Yeah.
career goes. It's kind of hard to just turn that off. But what are some of the things that you think that might help folks, kind of make that transition and kind of flip that switch a little bit easier?
Yeah, I'm imagining, the conversations how I used to talk to Marines and other pilots and in the ready room and, 23 years of building the habit of, you know, how you talk, the words you use, the jokes you make. That doesn't always translate perfectly. Now,
Yeah.
listen, to that point, you got to authentically be yourself. You should not go out into the private sector and become some sort of robot, but you definitely want to consider how you communicate and the way in which you deliver that. I think having a family is a really good, and if you don't have it, you can learn this. It's not something it's a requirement, but I had a family, while I was in the Marine Corps, married with kids during my time in the Marine Corps. And one of the things that I learned, and I learned this from my wife, and she has said this in my career, had said it more than once, she's just like, hey, I'm not one of your Marines. And that was kind of her way of catching me, like I had slipped into maybe just some habitual tendencies and habits of how I might talk to a fellow pilot or a fellow Marine. Hey, these people aren't your Marines, these people aren't your soldiers. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
the point behind that is, I think it's a very good lesson in life and something that it's really not hard to cultivate this if you spend a little time thinking about it is everybody's a little bit different. And how you interact with people, really, you should always be looking for the best way to interact and the best way to communicate with someone that's in their best interest rather than be like, hey,
Mm.
this is just how I am. You got to just deal with it. I always look to see what is the best way. I see this with my kids all the time. I communicate with my kids in ways I wish I never had to, but I got, a couple of teenage daughters and they like using, social media and stuff and I can message them and they're much happier doing that than calling on the phone or talking in person sometimes, like, okay, I'll do it your way. And if it's a better way to share interactions that way, because that's how they want it, I try to be a little more accommodating. And I think the point behind that is I think the best thing you can do when you transition out to start to build good habits is try to just focus on the strength of the relationship with the people you're meeting for the first time. These are new folks. And one of the key elements of building a strong relationship is acclimating and accommodating them. Learning about them, learning what their interests are, learning how they like to do certain things, and try to adjust your way to strengthen that relationship is a really good way to do it. If your goal is to walk in and like, hey, this is who I am and how I am, and I'm not going to change, your relationships are going to suffer. And the best thing you can do when you get out of the military and transition to the private sector is the same thing you did in the military, which is strengthen the relationships as best you can. And one of the key elements of a strong relationship with someone that you just met anew is learning how they are, what makes them tick, what their preferences are, what they like, what they dislike, and trying to make some adjustments and having the humility to make the change to acclimate to them. And that will help you with them. It'll help you recognize that the way I might have talked to, the Marines in the Red Room doesn't work for everybody. And if you're
Yeah.
lucky enough to meet some folks that cool, you can share that experience with them. That's good to go. But like my wife always reminded me, I'm not one of your Marines. Well, neither are your friends in this new job. Neither are your neighbors. Neither is this new community. They're just people. Learn about them, strengthen that relationship, meet them where they are, and that'll help you along the way.
Yeah, and it doesn't, to that point, I don't think you mean necessarily like don't be yourself, but
Exactly.
also, be yourself, but also, be accommodating to that person.
Yeah.
If they're not gonna, take those jokes that you told in the Marine Corps, they're not gonna take those jokes the same way that a Marine might. Maybe leave those jokes at the door and and don't kind of go down that path with them. But you can be flexible too, I think. You
Yeah.
can still be
That's a great
yourself
word.
without having the intensity. Maybe kind of just water it down a bit and kind of calm it down just a bit so it's not so in your face and so, you know, unpalatable for some people
Yeah.
to kind of
It's
take,
good
and
advice. It's
I
good
I know a
advice.
lot of us in the military veterans and whatnot definitely, we would get along just fine having the conversations that we normally would have had in the military, and we wouldn't have a problem with it. But when you take that outside to other folks, it just doesn't hit the same way that it would with another veteran or another service member or something. So that's a tough thing, but it really does help to build the trust amongst folks and, create a new team, that get that camaraderie that a lot of us miss when we get out of the military. I think those things are really a big piece of it, is just working to build that team together and those relationships all together, like
Yeah,
you were talking about,
that's right.
um, and we were talking about ownership before a little bit too, and I think there's a fine line between taking ownership of your mistakes and the things that might have gone wrong, and then completely beating yourself up over them. And I think that it's kind of tough to find that balance sometimes, but I think it's also necessary. And so when you're like, hey, this is just how I am in, this kind of environment, and this is just who I am. Well, maybe you need to take a step back and say, hey, I need to take ownership of this and kind of change a little bit of that, just so I can get along with these people, and I got to work with these people. I can't really change that unless I go find another job, but I need to do something about that. Versus beating yourself up and saying, well, nobody gets me, and I'm just this outcast, and nobody's gonna be able to deal with me or whatever. And it's a totally different game when you take a little bit of ownership of that versus totally beating yourself up over that kind of situation too, right?
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point inside there, and I think ultimately the word that you use is the right word. Is there's a balance inside there? There absolutely is, and
Mm,
maybe one of the most ironic things about the title of the book, "Extreme Ownership," is that you probably shouldn't, for the most part, be operating in the extremes. The extremes are places, for the most part, we want to avoid. And I think in that regard, if there's an attribute about you, there's a tendency that you might have, or just a natural state of things, hey, that's okay. But that doesn't mean you can't soften that a little bit or make some adjustments or look to strike a little bit of a balance inside there. And I think that is true for the idea of ownership as well. We certainly believe in the idea that if there's one place that you really want to push the limits, is you try to want to take as much ownership of you as you can. But if that becomes negative or debilitating or destructive or counterproductive, we're not doing it right. We're out of balance. So even in the idea of taking ownership, there is a balance around that. And I think you
mm.
said a really good example of that. I absolutely want to take personal responsibility for those things. At the same time, I have to be my authentic self and be who I am. And that doesn't mean I should be rigid and inflexible, and it doesn't mean I should completely reinvent myself, as a fake production to impress other people. There's a
Sure.
balance inside there between being who I am, and accommodating for the people around me to try to find, some moderate middle ground there. And ownership is no different. If you're taking it so much that it's starting to feel destructive, you're doing too much, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it, out of balance. Find that good balance. And balance, by the way, I think is a good approach to all things. Trying to be balanced as often as you can. Like I said, it's ironic. Avoid the extremes as often as you can.
Yeah, and you're right. It is ironic. That is the name of the book there, and it's a great book, and it has a lot of great
Awesome.
lessons in it. But the extremes, like for me, just as an example, I find that I operate in chaos pretty well. Like I can find I the calm in the chaos, and I can figure my way through those types of situations. A few little while ago, my wife had a medical issue, and I was on the phone with paramedics or 911 and all that, and I was about as calm as you could be. My kids were freaking out. But I was like, just I was calm. I was, hey, this is the situation in front of me. I'm just gonna focus on this and deal with that situation. And but to that point, I don't want to operate in that all the time. I want
Yeah.
to avoid those extremes at all
Yeah.
costs. Those types of things are not. I'm glad that I was able to handle that situation well, and it turned out with a positive outcome, and that's great. But I don't want to live there. I don't want to live in a constant state of chaos and a constant state of these extreme, whether it's emotions or things that are going on in your life. That's to me just too much, and I think I need to you know stay away from those as much as possible. But knowing that if those situations do come up, I can handle them, and
Yeah.
that's a good thing. And so, to your point, avoid those extremes if you can, and live somewhere in the middle. And yeah, of course that balance is going to swing one way or another, and sometimes it's going to swing real far to the left or to the right, and you're going to have to deal with that at that point. But try to level it out and get back to the center as quickly as you can. And I think that's the best way to deal with it. You know, and so kind of to wrap this up and kind of put this all together here for the veteran who might be listening here, who's feeling stuck in their life. Maybe it's their job, their family, or just maybe just stuck in their own head, can't get out of their own way, and that type of thing.
Yeah.
What is one leadership principle that you think they could apply today to just start moving in a better direction, to get themselves on a better path?
Yeah, one of the things that was really remarkable to me when I left the Marine Corps, I'd grown up my entire life just completely committed to the idea of being a fighter pilot in the Marine Corps. I was obsessed with it. It just, from about 13, 14, 15 years old, like that is my entire life was geared towards that. And amazingly, I left the Marine Corps, 20 plus years later, because I had lost a little bit of that passion. I had lost some of that.
Mm,
And what I discovered was there's a whole nother world that's out there that's so much bigger than I had ever realized. And it's really hard to see that when you're singularly focused. And it's really hard to see that when you're kind of borderline obsessed about. And listen, a lot of folks in the military, the men and women that join, to their credit, they're fully, fully committed to that. And it's hard to recognize that there might be something else out there that you can drive and derive the same interest, the same passion, and the same positivity that comes from that. But I'm telling you, it's there. And what it
mhm,
requires is you got to look for it a little bit. And I think it gets back to something that we talked about earlier about what is the motivation of the transition? What are you looking for? You know, I don't begrudge anybody that wants to have a good, stable job where you make gut money and can provide for your family. I think that's a wonderful thing. But if that comes at the expense of passion, of commitment, of engagement, of the things that really draw you to that, it is just a matter of time before that is corrosive. And to your point earlier as well, it won't just be corrosive for you, it'll be corrosive for the people around you. So I think
mhm,
there's a really important exercise of prioritize and execute as you're making your transition, or let's say you've made it and you look back and like, man, I don't feel like I ended up in the right spot. First thing, tell yourself is hang on, take a deep breath. There is an entire world out there. There is something that you can and will find that invokes that same interest. And if you can remove yourself from what you were doing in the past, and okay, that is in the past, I'm going to go do something different. And you think about the things that you care about, the things that you're into. What you're going to discover is there's a whole bunch of different options, and there's a little bit of a mechanical process in doing that. And you make a checklist and do those things, but ultimately you have to find something that you believe in. Now, if you believe in this thing, whatever it is, I don't care what it is. I have no judgment of any job that you might want to do or any profession you pursue. If you find interest and belief in it, and you take the lessons from the military, you work really, really hard, which means you're good at it. I can guarantee you what will follow will be the success and the money and the stability that comes with it. So part of that is just getting it in the right order. And so if you find yourself stuck or find yourself frustrated or find yourself not where you wanted to be, there's a potential that we have those things out of order, and you might have to take a little step back, acknowledge maybe you put yourself in a place you don't want to be, salvageable, fixable, no factor, good. Let's start to think about what you really care about, what you're interested in. Then you can pursue that in a way that you find what that is, you believe in what that is, you make an effort to get involved in that, you're good at that, you commit to that. The byproduct will be is you will find that success, you will find that stability, you will find the outcome, and it'll be positive for everybody, and your life will get better. Anything you want to do, you can do. That opportunity is out there.
That's amazing. That's such great advice. Dave, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing these leadership insights and all these principles that you've been able to share. Before we wrap up, where can people go to find out more information about you and Echelon Front and
Yeah,
everything
yeah.
else that you're into?
Easiest thing to do is straight up just go to echelonfront.com. That's our website. That's a
Perfect.
leadership consultancy. There's links to me there. If you're really bored, you can just, Google my name, Dave Burke. As long as you spell it Berke, you'll find everything from, the podcast we talked about, the books that we all wrote. Just it's all out there. But Echelon
Mhm.
Front's an easy way to get a hold of me. And I'm on social. If anybody listening to this wants to ask me a question, fire away. I'm pretty good about, at least Instagram. I'm pretty good about answering questions or YouTube. So happy
Excellent.
to interact with anybody, especially veterans, going through this search for themselves. If I could ever help, I absolutely would love to hear from anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the listeners, there are a hell of a lot more insights from Dave here on their website. All these articles that you've written and all these things on leadership and all the things, letting go of things that you can't control and all these things that I was scrolling through your page earlier before we got started here, and I was like, these are some golden nuggets that you have listed here. So anyone wants to find out a little bit more about Dave and his insights, go check out the website. I'll have a link to that in the show notes for the listeners as
Awesome.
well. But it's a great place to go, and definitely reach out and get in touch with Dave and his team, because I feel like you guys will definitely find solutions for folks who are struggling with one thing or another, whether it's in their business or personal lives or whatever. So Dave, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I was looking forward to this conversation for quite some time, and I'm glad we finally got a chance to make it happen. So thanks again.
Dude, this is awesome, man. Thank you. Appreciate it.